What role do media outlets in Vancouver play in supporting and including the viewpoints of multicultural and newcomer communities? Does anybody have any thoughts?
Don't be shy, and you could speak from your own perspective. What you
When you mean media outlets, do you mean mainstream media or local, very centralized media that's targeted towards certain communities?
I would say all the above. Take a pick and go with it.
I think we should start by talking about what do they have access to when they come here. For immigrant families, I remember for my family, first thing we got was Shaw Cable with, what was it, 28 channels or something, and that was a basic. That was the basics that we had. We didn't have a computer back then. That was about 9 years ago. But now that's changed because of lack of the information, and they were looking for lack of involvement. They moved to they have a satellite now, and they don't even have cable. They don't even watch the local news of any sort, and there's they still don't speak the language or English. They're not that comfortable. They don't. They've given up, I guess, being involved, and they're watching television shows that kind of bring message from back home, rather than trying to integrate into society here. So, and internet's also helped them with that, of connecting back. So,
I think that's something that happens across the board. Now I can give Shaw as an example. Shaw is now targeting people like your parents and putting cable packages together that are, get 5 Asian channels from Hong Kong or from Beijing, or South Asian channels, right? So it's obviously there's a huge demand for having media that is servicing these communities that are newcomers, that English is not their first language, that still want a connection back to the home country, but these aren't, a lot of the times they're not locally produced, and they're also not representative of the local ethnic communities, but rather the communities that exist in those home countries. So
when we were in Halifax, Calgary, Omni asked me that question. He said, what do you think of this cultural media that do exactly that? Are they creating silos and postponing the integration in a Canadian society, or are they being helpful? So I'm just putting that out there so that we can move that in our discussion as we move forward. Yes.
My name is Alden Havakon. I'm the manager of Intercultural Understanding Strategy Development. I'm also the former manager of diversity initiatives for CBC Television. And so this is a question that comes up quite often. You might be familiar with the Metropolis Project, which is this was about 20% of the conference's topic was related to media and the idea of is there even a thing as a virtual enclave, for example. So I spoke on a panel on that. One of the things that came up in response to this question is, first, in order for a media outlet to exist in Canada, it must by CRTC regulations produce a certain percentage of local content. So that's a mandatory policy. So on the surface, so my in-laws are Chinese. So on the surface, because I don't understand the language, it looks like all they're watching is content coming from Hong Kong. But in fact, there is a mandatory amount of local content that Fairchild must produce to stay in business in Canada. So, and I'm not sure if anyone here is from ethnic media, but they are very adamant as to the amount of local content they produce. The other thing I want to point out is that if there are events in the community, the only people who show up, the only media who show up to cover the community events are ethnic media. We're actually calling ethnic media growth media now, because in the Canadian media landscape, they are the only media chains that are actually growing. They're the only ones hiring any new talent. They're the only ones who have enough of a workforce to send out to anything that doesn't involve a fire, doesn't involve a house being burnt down. So I know there is this perception that there are families that all they do is watch in-language, what we're calling in-language television, and that the material is only coming from overseas. I know that perception exists, but in reality, it's not as acute of an issue as I think it might be perceived by English and French-speaking Canadians because of our CRTC regulations and the fact that they are the only ones actually showing up to local events. And if you had a local party, for example, in your community, it'd be much easier for you to get the Chinese, Fairchild and Omni to come to to cover your party than it would to get the CBC, Global, or CTV would probably not come. So that's something to kind of note. The other thing is, you know, in terms of what role do media outlets play, I mean, there is this assumption that this question is kind of phrased in such a way that multicultural and newcomer communities aren't part of the Vancouver mainstream, when in fact they are. You know, they're very much a part of the Vancouver mainstream. We have a new mainstream in Canada. It's inclusive of a lot of people, and so media outlets, their real purpose in being is to generate audience. That's what keeps them in business. And if they're not relevant to the audiences of their local markets, they're not going to be around for very long. And so if the market so happens to be, you know, XYZ, they have to reflect that. Otherwise, they disappear. Mm-hmm. That's just the fact of it. And you know, in order to stay relevant, they have to include the viewpoint. Some media outlets do a better job than others, but you know, I don't know if my concern is that we continue to frame this multicultural and newcomer audience as something other than the mainstream of Canada.
Exactly. What we did with the sense of belonging, that's what we were driving at, and many of the people we spoke to, that's what they told us. Mm-hmm. The issue of access came out loud and clear, and well, the communities that we spoke to, but it's so nice to hear another varying point of view, because first of all, when we ask them, would you encourage your child to consider media as a career option, the majority of these groups, they would rather prefer their children doctors, lawyers, you know, the usual back home strategy. But this is very, very interesting that you think that, and I want everybody to reflect on that, that some of these Canadians from ethno-cultural groups feel that really they are part of an integrated society. They are part of Canadian, and they talk on behalf of Canada, and they are not isolated in their culture silos.
And just as an observer of all this, I mean, I'm not coming from your background, but just as an observer, I think it's what in language programming, what it manifests, right? So just looking at the Lower Mainland or looking at Vancouver, you have your Indian people in Surrey, you have your, you know, Asian people in Richmond, you have your Persian people in North Van, and that's what everyone has accepted, and how that manifests and translates from a business perspective. Mm-hmm. All business is done in language, and pockets of communities continue to essentially not be integrated because they're not interacting with each other. They're not interacting with sort of whatever mainstream is or whatever that looks like, and everything is done within that whole cultural nuance. So realistically, somebody can come here from another country, not know a word of English, not need to know a word of English, and continue their whole lives within that, and I don't want to call it ghettoized, but within that kind of cultural state. So I mean, I don't agree with some of what you're saying.
All I'm saying is that to assume that because it's in language or it's ethnic media, that it's not local. I think that's a wrong assumption.
He said that his parents had a satellite, and majority of the time satellite viewing is actually from Iran.
Okay.
Or
that's where it
from
came
Hong Kong.
Okay.
They're
From
not-
LA
they don't-
actually mostly.
From LA as well, and trust me, there's no CRTC down there, so that's what he was trying to, and we at Shaw are trying to get people to subscribe to Fairchild, so to not have satellite dishes. But trust me, I can even speak for my own relatives. I'd say 80% of my relatives do have a satellite and do have that programming that comes externally from Canada. So that's a problem.
And I think from what you said, my family doesn't live. They're Persian. They don't live in North Van. And that, you know, where does my family, for instance, fit? within that context. You know, they sit at home now and they watch satellite. You know, that's become their life because they go out and they're not familiar with anyone, and there's no integration really, and there's nothing that connects them to everything else. And there is actually a Persian language the channel or a program that runs on Shaw, I believe, once a week or something like that. But they were watching that at the beginning, but they gave up because, I mean, that program just played some music videos for them or had something, but not really anything, and definitely didn't connect them to the society here, you know, of the community. There was no community building through that media. I think, you know, this physical separation of them is a problem, but I think media could be something that kind of brings them back together.